What if I told you there's a way for students to boost their exam grades by 5 points? No lottery ticket, no secret sauce, and definitely no sacrificing your weekends to the grading gods. Just four proven teaching strategies, a bit of digital support, and some good old consistency. Sound too good to be true? It's not. And in this special episode of Digging into the Data, we've got the numbers to prove it. Welcome to the What and Who of EDU, where we bring you insights from the leading educators, researchers, and innovators shaping the future of teaching and learning. From emerging teaching trends to real-world classroom strategies, we break it down to help you create a more impactful and effective learning experience. Today on Digging into the Data, we're exploring the impact of four evidence-based teaching strategies. There's data-driven instruction, formative assessment with feedback, active learning, and metacognition. The data comes from a large-scale study that took place in 2022 and 2023 over 3 semesters and included over 1,400 college students. It was funded by the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation and conducted by Macmillan Learning. To help us unpack it, we're joined by Marcy Baughman, Vice President of Learning Science and Research at Macmillan Learning. Together, we'll explore which strategies had the biggest impact, why the most effective ones are often used the least, and we'll share one simple habit for each strategy that instructors can try, like tomorrow, to support all their students. Because when you pair research-backed strategies with thoughtful implementation, well, that's where the real magic happens. Thank you so much for joining us, Marcy. I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit more about what you were hoping to learn with this particular study.
We were fortunate enough to receive a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation about 3 years ago. And the goal of the grant was to understand how the implementation of evidence-based teaching strategies influence student course retention. So that's their retention within a 1 semester or 1 quarter course, and also their learning outcomes. And we primarily focused on their course performance, but we also looked at exam performance because we understood that exams make up typically the majority of a course performance, but there are other things that affect course performance, like participation or even attendance or quiz scores and homework. And so we wanted to look at each of those on their own. We focused on students who were in gateway courses because our working theory was that students are more at risk of dropping out of college during the first year or two when they are taking courses that aren't necessarily related to their major. And when they're not related to their major, perhaps they're not as interested in the courses, and so they don't spend as much time on them, or they're not as easy for them. So this study very much focused on understanding whether an instructor's decision or choice to implement evidence-based teaching strategies was able to positively influence students remaining in their course and students performing well in their course.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what exactly is an evidence-based teaching strategy?
There are a multitude of evidence-based teaching strategies, but we chose to focus on 4 of the most prevalent or popular evidence-based teaching strategies. And we chose those, frankly, in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so we focused on data-driven instruction, which is essentially, like it sounds, using data, like quiz data or even student response data in the class. Like, I can answer this question correctly or not to inform the instruction that instructors are actually delivering. We focused on active learning, which is just providing students opportunities to actively participate in their learning. So instead of sitting and passively receiving a lecture, they might be doing something like working in a small group. We focused on formative assessment with feedback. Formative assessment is meant to be those lower stress moments for students where they take a quiz and the information sought from that is able to guide the instructor into what they might assign next or what they might talk about next in class. And then lastly, we looked at metacognition. Metacognition happens to be my favorite, but is also somewhat ambiguous. So metacognition is really thinking about how you think or trying to better understand the practices that you can utilize in order to learn.
I am with you. I'm such a fan of metacognition. And we did put out a digging into the data specifically about that. And I know part two of this is going to get more into what we learned about metacognition and sense of belonging. But let's dig into the data on evidence-based teaching. We'll start with what surprised you the most? What shocked you the most when you learned it?
There were two things that shocked me the most. The first was that instructors were able to share with us how they implemented evidence based teaching strategies quite accurately. They were very honest. But what we also found was that there were digital resources that supported evidence based teaching practices or strategies that were also equally important. So I didn't expect that a digital resource, like, for example, a quiz that we call Learning Curve, which acts as a formative assessment with feedback, was able to have as large of an impact on our student outcomes as an instructor also implementing formative assessment with feedback in the class using something like the iClicker or student response system, where they were getting feedback from their students in the moment and then adjusting their instruction or giving students feedback in the moment. So that was the number one aha moment for me, which frankly, fantastic for our online or even our hybrid learners, right? Because if they don't get that ability or opportunity to interact with their instructor, they can still deeply benefit through the resources. The second thing that surprised me the most was that metacognition had such an outsized effect on our students' performance. Metacognition is, for me, such a quiet instructional strategy. It is thinking about your learning, it is students planning, students reflecting, evaluating their own learning. And those words sound easy in practice, but you have to be mindful in order to execute or implement them. And so instructors would often say to us, like, this is difficult. It is, I can tell it's important. I want to be able to support my students with metacognitive activities, but I'm not sure I'm doing it right. And so what we found was that instructors who were able to implement metacognitive activities or practices had students who really benefited deeply and performed very well. They made very large gains, in particular their course performance.
So it sounds like metacognition out of all of the four had the biggest impact. Am I right in thinking that?
Metacognition did have the biggest impact, particularly for certain subgroups of learners. So overall, it had a very large impact. And then when you drove down to subgroups, it just got larger and larger. It was very powerful to witness and be able to share.
Give me an example. Like, what's a subgroup that benefited more from metacognition?
So, our students who we gave a demographic survey at the beginning of the study, and we asked a lot of different questions about students because we wanted to be able to control for the different demographics that typically can influence student outcomes, like whether they were a first generation student or whether English was their first language or their second language or even their third language. And so, when we took all of that into account, what we found is that students who identified as Black received the greatest gains in student outcomes when they practice metacognitive activities. And so it was a very powerful predictor of student performance for students who identified as Black.
Are there any other indicators for other demographics that you noticed?
Yes. So our Latino students had the best improvements when they worked with the digital resources. So when you look at evidence based instructional strategies, which are delivered by the instructor, compared to evidence based teaching digital resources, Latino students in particular had outsized benefits or gains from engaging with and completing the digital resources. Reflecting on another subgroup, the white students benefited equally as well from both the digital learning resources as well as the instructional strategies, so long as they were evidence based. They saw outsized gains regardless of which type of interaction they received.
So, among the four strategies that you studied, which ones do you think are the most ready to scale, and which ones do you think still need more support?
I would say the instructional strategies that are most easy to scale are going to be the data driven instruction and the formative assessment with feedback. These are strategies that have been around for decades, and most of our instructors are already using data in some format to inform their not only their instruction, but how they plan their courses, how they assess students. They're essentially trying to use data to serve their students the best and to meet all learners where they are. The formative assessment could be something as simple as having students volunteer in a class their responses to a multiple choice item, and then understanding if the majority of the class got it right or wrong. And if they got it wrong, digging deeper into why they got it wrong, and then having a conversation about it. The metacognition was the most difficult for instructors to feel confident that they were doing well. So instructors would often say to us, like, I get the premise. I understand that I want to support my students in planning and monitoring and evaluating and reflecting on their learning. However, I'm not sure how to incorporate that into my classroom activities in a way that feels deliberate and mindful. And so instructors were always looking for guidance or advice or resources to help them improve their metacognitive support for students. In contrast, instructors would report that they felt most confident about their ability to implement active learning. But when we asked their students if they recognized the active learning opportunities, students were less likely to report that they felt they were actively learning, which was a really interesting contrast for us, because what that was telling us is that even when students were not being passive participants in the learning experience, and they weren't able to call out that they were actively learning either. So for example, if you broke students into small groups, students would still consider that just part of the classroom experience. They weren't recognizing that they were being active participants in their own learning. And so I think in the realm of active learning, we have some more work to do in number one, just offering our instructor support, guidance, activities, resources to support active learning. But number two, helping our students to learn when they are actually being an active participant in their learning.
I wonder if the difference between instructor perceptions and student perceptions is students don't feel like they're actually learning in their active learning. So they're in group work worried about what is my role in this project versus like, okay, I'm learning something from my peer.
That's an excellent point. And sometimes what I think is also happening is students, more than ever post COVID, are feeling some anxiety about, for example, partnering with another student or being in a group or needing to discuss the results or even just like raise their hand and answer a question. So we're hearing from students more and more that these are anxiety producing experiences for them. They prefer working independently, quietly, and not partnering with somebody else. And so maybe they're so focused on the context of having to share out loud or partner, they're not able to see the benefit as quickly that they are actually actively contributing to their own learning.
So if I'm an instructor with one of those super shy students who might not think of active learning as active learning, and I want them to be engaged with their learning experience, is there like one simple, super easy tactic to help that happen?
Yeah. We've been thinking about that a lot. What we have determined is that students can also digitally participate in interactions with their peers. And that seems to take away some of that barrier or anxiety for the students because the online environment or interaction feels safer or more natural to them. There's students who spend a lot of times on their phone and in and social media apps. And so offering opportunities for students to contribute or partner in a more digital way seems to remove some of those barriers and anxieties that present themselves with like an actual face-to-face conversation or actively working in a group face-to-face.
Interesting. So, as we're thinking about instructors changing tactics that they might use, did you notice any instructors changing tactics like midway through the study because they were seeing something work so differently or so successfully?
We did see tremendous growth and change with our participating study instructors over the course of the semester. And I will say the instructors really recognized it as well because it wasn't necessarily natural, right? And it wasn't always easy. So instructors received professional development at the beginning of the semester, but not a lot. It was basically a one full day, 8 hours broken up over the course of a couple different sessions where they received some strategies and some training on how to implement evidence-based teaching practices. And what we saw is that instructors became much more mindful, for example, of using different sources of data to inform their instruction. They became much more mindful of ensuring that there were formative assessments built throughout the semester that offered students feedback in the moment to improve their learning. Instructors 100% grew in their implementation of metacognition simply by being more aware. They did things like They would post learning objectives on the board and then ask students to reflect on whether they had learned what was in the learning objective by the end of the class. And if not, let's get some feedback on it. I think, Marissa, what I found very fascinating, though, was how many instructors said, whew, now I've gotten through a semester and I can think of all of the things I want to change next semester. Because what they would often tell us is that they felt very much like they were doing trial and error through the course of the first semester. They felt like they were still learning from their mistakes. They were figuring out what worked and, more importantly, what didn't. And they were already making plans for their next semester to adjust not only their teaching practices, but their curriculum, right? So I want to offer more formative assessment with feedback. So I'm going to incorporate more quizzes instead of just one massive exam at the end of the semester. And that was really, I have to admit, it was really gratifying to hear from our instructors because we knew that we were the start of change for them. It wasn't just a one semester and done.
Yeah. And I can't imagine it's easy to pivot mid-semester. They've already got their curriculum. The students already know what to expect.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you had to pick one teaching habit that every instructor should try tomorrow based on what you learned from this study, what would you tell them to do?
This is a great question because it's not necessarily something that I think instructors should do, but I think it's something instructors should coach their students towards. And it's a metacognitive activity where instructors help their students to set goals, small definable goals for either the week, for the semester, for their entire college experience, however they want to look at it. Set the goal, help students to reflect on whether they are accomplishing the goal, and then decide where they need to make correction to their goal so that they can accomplish it. What we have noticed is that students oftentimes are coming into a semester and maybe they have 3 courses, maybe they have 5 courses. The bottom line is they're already overwhelmed. In all likelihood, these courses have like 5 different discipline areas. They have 5 different instructors with very different teaching styles. And so students have a very difficult time figuring out the actions and the activities that they need to complete in order to accomplish their goal. And so having somebody remind them that just setting a goal intentionally is very important and then reflecting on your progress will help them actually accomplish the goal. And I think instructors can be a very powerful, positive influence on their students by providing that mentorship.
Okay. Now, I'm guessing they can either do this manually or there's some tech that can help them along the way. Did you want to tell me a little bit about both options?
Yes, in Achieve, we have the goal setting and reflection surveys, and there's like a low barrier to entry here. So the students take an introductory survey, typically at the beginning of the semester. They set goals. Like they work towards understanding how they can accomplish those goals. I need to study for 30 minutes every day. I need to understand where my best study environment is. I need to get a B in this class and this class. So I am working towards a B. And these are the activities that I need to take. And then you can either pick you can do it every month, you can do it after a major exam. But what students do is take follow up, or we call them checkpoint surveys, where they're actually reflecting on their progress. And then they are making adjustments to their plan, what's working, most importantly, what is not working. Let's come up with a new plan, and then let's carry forward. And you keep doing that every month or so. It takes less than 15 minutes, but it helps students to visualize their goal and anticipate what they need to do in order to accomplish it. It takes students maybe like 20-ish minutes a month. For instructors, what I would recommend is just start to get in the practice of putting your learning outcomes or your learning objectives on the board each day, helping students to understand this is what I want you to learn today. If at the end of just this 1-hour lesson, you feel confident in this outcome or this objective, then we have hit our goal. And if you haven't, giving your instructor feedback that you don't feel confident in what you've learned today is going to help the instructor course correct and come back the next time and offer a different way of thinking about the problem or a different way of learning.
So interesting. I love the practical tips for both the instructors and the students. So one other question here before we get into like the big picture dreamer one. This is digging into the data. Do we have any hard data that tells us the impact that evidence-based teaching practices have?
We do have hard data. When we know that instructors routinely assign evidence-based teaching resources and students complete them, they perform about 5% higher on their exams than students who don't routinely complete them.
So you're telling me If you follow these evidence-based practices, your students are going to perform 5% better.
On their exam scores, yes. One other thing that we learned that is critically important, instructors need to assign the evidence-based teaching digital resources. And I know that seems so simple, but if you think about it, an instructor has to be very mindful in the assignments that they give to their students, right? They can't assign students three homework problems or three homework assignments every class. And so being very choiceful in the resources that they assign is critically important because it also signals to the student that these are the important ones to complete that will ultimately benefit me through my exam. So when instructors are mindful and they frequently assign evidence-based teaching resources to their students and they complete them, those students perform about 5% higher than their peers who are either in classrooms where instructors just aren't assigning them or the students are choosing not to complete them.
Okay, final question. If you had all of the budget and resources in the world, what would you explore next as it relates to evidence-based teaching?
This is a really good question because I have like a trifecta of things that I would really like to explore next. So, as we've opened up the world of evidence-based teaching practices, we're of course continuing to focus on these four core strategies that we've just discussed. I do think we need to continue focusing in on metacognition. We need to figure out the in-class ways of supporting student metacognition, as well as the virtual ways and the digital ways we can support it. We know it has outsized benefits, and we know students are going to improve all of their outcomes when they engage in metacognitive activities. I also think that we need to continue focusing on active learning because we know that when students feel like they are actively learning, when they can recognize it, it feels interesting to them. It feels engaging to them. When students are interested, they're more likely to pay attention. They're more likely to feel like the content is relevant to them and is interesting to them, and they perform better. But lastly, sense of belonging is becoming a construct that is embraced in the evidence-based teaching world. Never would have thought it, I have to admit. I always thought it was like a softer construct, a touchy-feely construct, but it turns out that sense of belonging is critically important because it tells students, I have a place in this classroom, I have a place on this campus, I belong here. I understand that I am valued as a human being here. And that is important to helping students become better learners, better students. So I would add that in my trifecta of areas to continue investing in.
Okay, that was a lot, but Marcy delivered. And buried in all that good data, there were some pretty practical gems. So let's break it down strategy by strategy. We'll start with the heavy hitter, metacognition. According to Marcy, it had the biggest impact on student performance, especially for students who identified as Black. But here's the twist. It's also the one strategy instructors felt the least confident using. So what can we actually do with that? Tip 1. Start class with a clear learning objective on the board. But don't stop there. End class by asking students to rate how well they met that objective and to jot down one thing they still don't understand. You can keep it old school with paper or go digital with a tool like Macmillan Learning Skill Setting and Reflection Survey and Achieve. It doesn't really matter how you do it, just that you do it consistently. These little reflection moments help overwhelmed students get clear and build some learning confidence while they're at it. Moving on to data-driven instruction. This one's already in most instructors' toolkits, but how that data gets used? Well, that's where things get interesting. Tip 2. Kick off class with a quick quiz or poll, and then use what you learned to pivot. If everyone bombed question 3, but they nailed question 1, don't just guess, dig into what threw them off. That one adjustment can turn your classroom into a feedback loop and not just a lecture hall. And now let's talk about formative assessment with feedback. Marcy shared that digital tools like Macmillan Learning's Learning Curve were just as effective as in-class feedback. That feedback loop made a real difference. Tip 3. Assign digital practice that talks back. Many digital learning platforms give students instant feedback after each question, especially if they're doing their homework with the AI tutor turned on. As an alternative, you can always use a tool like iClicker in class to gauge where they're at in real time. Either way, when feedback is fast and specific, improvement comes a lot quicker. And finally, active learning. And this one came with a bit of a twist. Instructors were using it, but students didn't always recognize it for what it was. Add to that the post-COVID anxiety around group work, and it gets a little complicated. So, tip 4 is make active learning visible. Actually call it out. This is a group activity. That's active learning. Students don't always know when they're doing the good stuff. And if they're shy or socially anxious, give them the option to participate digitally. This could be a shared doc, a chat space, or even collaborative slides. They all count, especially when you're doing them consistently. So that may have been more like 6 or 7 tips, but who's counting? We'll just call it a bingo bonus or 2. Four strategies, 5% gains, and at least 6 tips depending on how you count. But one thing's for sure, when instructors use evidence-based practices intentionally, students win. And with that, we wrap up this episode of Digging into the Data. Thank you again to Marcy for all of her insights on evidence-based teaching practice. Wait till you hear what she has to say next week about metacognition and sense of belonging. It's going to blow your mind. But what do you think? Have you tried one of these strategies? Or do you have a tip for other teachers that you'd love to share? We want to hear it. So leave us a voicemail at 512-765-4688, and you might just be featured in a future episode. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share. It helps more educators join in on the conversation and keeps us digging into what works. I'm Marisa Bluestone, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to dig into the data on the what and who of EDU.